We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings. This is Byrne, the Anadromist, person who goes against the stream. And that's why I'm doing this. Because I'm trying to encourage other people to go against the stream. And there's a lot of swift currents pushing us in seemingly one direction. And as much as people want to go, or at least imagine they're going some other way, I think as long as you have that idea that we are going to change the world and it's going to be a better place, you are probably in deep trouble. It isn't until you see the actual problem that you can begin to, as Jacques Ellul said, to profit from the cracks of freedom. Because it isn't in our power and strength. It isn't in a mass movement. It isn't in anything that's particularly, nothing that gets really popular in a certain way ever really helps. There are moments, I think, in history when things do change. There are times of historical epochs I wouldn't mind have been a part of, but even in those, there's always the frustrations of life. Death is always a reality. Evil is always a reality. So, to continue, well, where was I? I'm wanting to have a conversation, and one of the things that I am most keenly aware of, there are a couple of things I am very keenly aware of about this time. One is the unreality that most people live in these days. It has to do with, you have a little phone and you're always on it and you're going oh my goodness, who's trying to get in touch with me now? And all of that's unreal. So much of what happens on any form of social media, including this, is unreal. You don't know me because you see me talking. You get a shard of who I am. You don't know and if you're playing a video game, what do you know about the real world? There's probably a few principles you can apply. Don't forget to get your special weapon to bring with you. Oh, we left it behind. We have to go back and go all the way back and go forward. Whatever. There are little principles you can learn, but as far as the real world goes, trust me, it doesn't connect at all. Movies are the same way. Books are in a certain way the same way, although I would say books are in a slightly different category. But I've been thinking about this question. The second thing, besides the unreality, which I will eventually spend way too much time talking about, but not today. The other thing I think is crucial to understanding, to help us find our way out of the virtual technological fog of the present, is to understand history, to understand some sense of the flow of history of where we are, and also to understand our own personal history. I'm not going to talk about personal history today, but I want to give someone, at least whoever is watching this thing, a sense of where we are, and how we got here. Now, obviously, history, anyone who really knows anything about history knows there's absolutely no way, look at whatever the time is on this thing, however many minutes are, I've finally recorded, I don't know how long it's going to be. I'm certainly not going to go on for too long, but that's relative. Some people might think, 5 minutes is too long. Someone else might think an hour is too short. I'll probably be closer, somewhere in between. But anyone who knows history really knows that whatever I'm about to say right now is going to be like skimming a rock across the pond. it's not going to say much at all. But I am trying not to give you any sense of the details as much as I think we need a sense of at least a somewhat agreed upon schematic of where we are. That is to say, some kind of sense of the flow of history and how we got here. So hopefully what I'm saying is not going to be too controversial, although I do think there are people who will gnaw and chew on my interpretation of things. That's fine. Have at it. I don't mind. But I'm going to start with the end of World War II as a place. And I have a very specific reason for wanting to start there. It is very clear to me I should then go back to the beginning of the 20th century to understand why World War II. And then it's really clear to me I should go back to the end of the Enlightenment era, beginning of the Romantic period to understand what happened then. And then it's really clear to me that, oh, well, I've got to go back to the Reformation and the Renaissance. And then it's really clear you have to go through the Middle Ages and understand some of that. And then you've got to go back to the Antique period and understand Rome and Greece and, and suddenly you're back at the beginning of things. And it's not going to be helpful to try to talk about everything. So let's try to talk about something we can manage. One problem with people doing this is they tend to spin off into conspiracy theories. And if I was to say one thing about where we are now, it's conspiracy theory central. That is to say, it's like people live on conspiracy theories, whether it's conspiracy theories about, the current topics of the day. Did Trump collude with Russia? Yes or no? Whether it's conspiracy theories of not long ago, who blew down the September 11th, World Trade Center buildings. Whether it's conspiracy theories about Kennedy, which we probably will discuss today, which is kind of like the granddaddy of all recent theories anyway. Or whether it goes back to, you want to take it back to flying saucers, and I have no truck with that stuff, but I've certainly read the literature. So World War II. First thing you need to know about World War II, we're not going to discuss the battles. We're not even going to discuss why it started, although that is all crucial. And to understand why World War II started helps us to understand why we are where we are. But that's too big for now anyway. So let's start with World War II just as an event. Military historian John Keegan said, the thing you have to remember about World War II, and this is crucial, is that it was the biggest event in history. Let me just say that again. The thing you have to John Keegan said that World War II was the biggest event in history. And there's no denying it. It involved so many corners of the globe. Now, we tend to think of World War II as happening mostly in Europe and Asia, with threatening to come to North America. But ask the Australians. Ask the South Americans if it affected them at all. Did it affect Antarctica? Not really. But nevertheless, World War II involved quite a bit of the globe. Now, John Keegan, in his book on World War II, states that over 50 million people died. His book came out, I believe, in the beginning of the 90s. I don't have my books with me because I'm living in Tbilisi, Georgia, and I moved from Alaska, and all my books are in storage, and I've got to find a way to get them here. So we won't discuss that today. But that's why I'm not pulling books off my shelf. As you can see, I don't have a shelf here. Although that is a nice brick, solid wall. I wish the whole place was like this. Is what I do here. There's a really nebulous wall to my next door neighbors that I can't hear them through. But okay. So actually, they've revised the figures now. I think if you look it up in Wikipedia or something, most people agree it was closer to 70 million. 70 million people died between, we'll say, the beginning of the Chinese War in about 1933 and the end of the war in 1945. That was pretty big. That really did something to people. And one thing we don't appreciate is what it did to the psyche of people. One of the things that happened right after World War II, and I know this happened in America, it happened in a very different way in Europe, and I'm sure it happened in other places in Asia, in differing kinds of degrees, was that people wanted to put it out of their mind. So a lot of people think that, they discovered the concentration camps in Germany and Poland, and so they immediately started talking about how terrible these things were. Oh no. They didn't do that. That happened much later. What they did was they went home. Yeah, they wanted to rebuild. They wanted to that's where America becomes the superpower, because afterwards, America was relatively unharmed. I mean, yes, we lost thousands and thousands of soldiers, and they came back to America. And the government had the GI Bill waiting for them, which allowed them to go to college on a shoestring budget. They started in the late 40s and 1950s, they started building the really serious interstate highway system in America. They started building more and more suburbs. People started getting television sets as this weird little device at first. I mean, really after the war, it was still Radio Land. But then by the mid-50s, television had pretty much taken over, although radio was still important as a place to get away. And that is where the rock and roll story starts. But we won't go there too much today, although that's really something I could talk about. Rather, the important thing is that when the soldiers went back to their homes, they didn't know how to communicate the experiences they went through. Yeah, they got thanked for it, much more so than anyone in the Vietnam War ever did. But did they talk about it? Not really. Ken Burns put out his great documentary series, which I highly recommend, The War, which is only about America's involvement in the war. I would love to see a documentary, for instance, about Australia's involvement in World War II or Australia's involvement in Vietnam. Most Americans have no clue that the Australians were even in Vietnam at the same time we were helping us. And that certainly affected them. Let alone, I mean, there's all sorts of interesting subjects from World War II that I've just never seen anybody really seriously tackle. One of those things is Yugoslavia during World War II. Yugoslavia lost over 1 million people during World War II. You ever heard a word about it? Probably not, unless you are of some sort of Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian descent, something like that, Kosovar, Montenegro, Macedonia. Unless you're like from one of those places, you probably don't know much about that. These are just things that the history of the media has kind of chosen to overlook. So, but in Ken Burns' documentary, The War, there's a young girl, she was young at the time, who was in a Filipino concentration camp. She was an American from California. And she went through this concentration camp experience and then watched the Manila fall to pieces at the end of the war. And I mean, what she describes is horrifying, from the food they had to eat or didn't eat, to the betrayals, to the bloodshed, to, the disease, all this stuff. And then she gets back to America, and she's relaying this as an older woman. And she says, I got back home and someone mentioned the war. She wanted to talk about it. She had to talk about it, but she couldn't. Because when people mentioned the war in America, they said things like, yeah, you wouldn't believe the gas rationing we had. You wouldn't believe how hard it was to drive around in our cars. Now, if that's the level of your discomfort, it's a little tough to listen to someone talking about eating rats and watching people getting their heads blown off. it's a different order of experience. Well, that girl's experience was relatively mild compared to what many soldiers went through. And we're just talking about America for the moment here, but the soldiers came back and basically mostly shut up. I've asked many people, do you remember who were like whose father had served in World War II? Do you remember your dad ever, when you were growing up, really talking about World War II and what happened in such a way that you got the feeling of the terror and nightmare of the war? And the answer was always no. I don't really remember. It was only later that a few stories came out. Or they would tell stories that were kind of funny. I remember a stepfather of mine when I was young telling a story about blowing a monkey's head off after the monkey threw crap at him in the jungles of the Philippines. It was a funny anecdote. You'd hear that kind of stuff. But what really happened? Why did that generation start to become alcoholics while at the same time they were heading off to tiki bars to kind of reminisce about the South Pacific? There was an old Italian guy named Lenny in New York City. I used to go to his shop, and it was down in Soho. And the reason I went to his shop is because I had a mailbox there. And so Lenny was in World War II, and one day, now Lenny was probably heading into his mid-80s by this point. Around 80 years old or so. And Lenny was an older Italian guy from, the old village Soho scene before all the hipsters and the artists and such moved in. And Lenny said to me one day, the thing that really gets me about my experiences as a soldier in World War II was the gang rape that I participated in. Well, that isn't the thing you really tell to your children. But that was an experience that, unfortunately, and this was in France, of some poor French girl. Yeah, these guys were just as ruined by war as any other generation has ever been. And I'm sure there was many tales of gallantry and stuff, but it was a nightmare. And interestingly enough, it isn't until you get to a movie like Saving Private Ryan, particularly the first half of the film, where you really get a sense of what it might have been like there. And so you had this generation of people who came back from the war, and they didn't talk about it. But what's funny is they're getting college educated. More importantly, they're going to all send their kids to college too. And their kids are going to go at a time when there's a lot of questions being raised in universities. So that's going to happen in the late 50s and 1960s. The children born in the 40s, we call them boomers now, but there's a big divide. I was born in 1955. There's a big divide between people like me born in 1955 and people born in, say, 1945. They've been dividing up the baby boomer years a little bit more lately. So, a generation was going to be born who was going to start asking questions. And they were going to be learning things like existentialism. What was that? They were going to be learning about, there were books being written in the 1950s about the corporation man, the man who just worked for the corporation and was this button-down was the word they used to use, button-down man. I remember when Bob Newhart's comedy records came down, they would always talk about the button-down mind. But it was a certain kind of a man who was a corporate man. He was going to work in this corporation. He was going to work and try to get a job in some place like IBM or General Electric. They were going to work at this place. They were going to get great benefits. They were going to live in a new suburb, nice and clean. We won't talk about the racial issues involved here. We don't want those Asian people or especially those black folks moving into our neighborhoods. Especially in California, these sort of rules came into being. But But no, there was a lot. There was, not only was there the existentialist movement, which had been germinating in Europe, which was starting to now breach on the shores of the American university system. But there was also the whole beat scene. Jack Kerouac, Ken Kesey, although Kesey's more the LSD. Kesey's the pivotal figure from Beats to Hippies. One of the pivotal figures. But you've got, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, and a number of other poets and writers who are beginning to question this whole American dream. I think the Korean War was the beginning for many people of like, why are we fighting this? They just didn't understand. Part of it was people were just tired of fighting. And so many people had died, but it was like, I think the world was concussed. It was like something much bigger than anyone could put in their minds had happened. I think something similar happened as the Black Plague went through in the 14th century through Asia and Europe. Something so big that it just completely upended everything. And in the Black Plague, that eventually led to things like the Renaissance and the Reformation, the psychic damage, you might say, of the Black Plague. And you could say, well, that was really good. Well, it wasn't simply good. There was a lot of, there was all that death for one thing, but it did make people question their concepts. And I would argue we're living in exactly that time now. Except it wasn't the Black Death. It was World War II. But it wasn't just World War II, because if you really understand this, World War II was a continuation of World War I. Now we're getting closer to talking about 90 to 100 million people. And if you add to it that World War I unleashed the communist revolution in Russia, if you add to it that World War I, the communist revolution suddenly opened up the doors in not only Russia, but China and Asia, you start the statistics of how many million people died in the 20th century is catastrophic. And that is what people were reacting to. By the time they got to, say, the mid-1950s, on their way to the 1960s, something was about to change. You can see it in one way, represented by the civil rights movement. Now, I would have to say that the early civil rights movement was an unqualified good for the most part. I can't see much wrong with it. Interestingly enough, it was a largely Christian movement, started in the churches, black churches in the South. Martin Luther King did not begin the civil rights movement, obviously. He came in as it started moving, and we won't discuss all of the, Rosa Parks and the bus, getting off the bus, the segregation and all that. It's all too big for us right now. But what was important to realize about the civil rights movement is that it set a new mindset that things did not have to stay the same. But the thing also about the civil rights movement is it didn't happen overnight. It starts about 1955 and goes on and on and on. And when during Kennedy's administration, when King gave the "I Have a Dream" speech, that was 1963. That was already 8 years later. It isn't until a couple more years with Lyndon Johnson's signing various civil rights legislation that you find not a conclusion to it, but that's when finally the dam seemed to break. However, even that was not a good conclusion. Interestingly enough, there's a documentary, Eyes on the Prize. And it was about the first half of the civil rights movement. It's a great documentary. That is to say, the first half of Eyes on the Prize is about the first half of the civil rights movement, going up to Johnson's signing of his civil rights legislation. But there's a second half to Eyes on the Prize that is almost impossible to see now. Why? It does not suggest a good resolution to the civil rights movement. It suggests the failure of the civil rights movement, because suddenly you have black nationalism. You have Malcolm X. Then Malcolm X gets assassinated. Then you have things like the rise of the SDS, and then you have the rise of things like the Black Panthers. You have the ghettos burning down. You have, and there were so many riots. And in fact, on the day Martin Luther King himself was assassinated in 1968, oh my goodness, there were riots and cities burning down across America. 68 was so huge, it's hard to put into, these days, everyone says, oh my goodness, the Los Angeles riots. But the Los Angeles riots were just like one little minuscule part of the 60s. That is to say, it was like the Watts riots. But there were like 20, 30 more riots of, talk about Detroit or Newark, New Jersey. These things were like war zones. And we tend to have, these are so bad that we tend to have put them in the same category as like World War II. We put them out of our minds. Now, there were changes, obviously, in black-white relationships in America as a result of the civil rights struggle. And there were good changes. However, one of the bad changes was that so many of the people who were the educated, middle class African Americans within their communities like Harlem or St. Louis, Missouri or whatever, had a chance to leave, live in nicer places. And so they took those chances because the ghettos were ghettos. They were slums. Drugs had started coming in the 1950s. Drugs supplied by the mafia, which is another story. But what's interesting is that suddenly all that was left in the ghettos were the poorest of the poor and a few very, altruistic souls. Try looking for the second half of Eyes on the Prize and see what happens. It's not available on Amazon. You can find it somewhere. Occasionally, you've been able to find it for like $200-300 for the whole set, or more. I think it's more, but it's almost like that half was censored because it was so bad. I'm not sure if it was. They say it's a rights issue, but yeah, I'm a little suspicious about that. But the civil rights movement also went along with something else, which I think I've been droning on long enough, and that was the folk revival movement, and or the folkies for short. I think I didn't realize how long I was going to talk about all this stuff right now. Let me just say a little bit more about the 1950s before we start talking about the folk music revival on the college campuses in the late 50s, early 60s. And that is, I want to say that I pointed out earlier the rise of television and superhighways and, the first fast food chains, suburbs. All of this is technological change. And technology was starting to grow in a way that it never had before, aided by the vast amount of wealth that America had accumulated, which would eventually lead to putting a person on the moon. So, technology also did something else. It radically transformed how we communicate with each other. I'm talking to you on a video. You might be watching this video on YouTube right now. That's a radical thing. I'm sitting in a room in a town with it has some economic difficulties for sure. And I am halfway across the world from the west coast of America. And I'm able to put this on a camera and upload it from here. Well, that's a radical transformation of how we communicate. That's just obviously one teensy-weensy little bit of how we communicate. Well, along with that change came the rise of propaganda, because as Jacques Ellul also points out in his book called Propaganda, which I highly recommend, and I will probably mention more in some other discussion, is that suddenly, and it's almost like we had to learn new propaganda techniques. I mean, there have always been different kinds of propaganda techniques. That "I want you" poster from World War I with Uncle Sam, that is like classic propaganda technique, to point at you and say, "I want you." And people actually responded to that. Men went to the war by the droves as a result of the propaganda campaign to get people in the war, just as much as they stayed away from it and wanted nothing to do with it at the beginning of World War I. That's World War I. By World War II, the Nazis had particularly found new forms of propaganda. And we had to match them in order to, in a sense, keep ourselves from falling into their webs. Because they were perfectly capable of using English in their propaganda. Also, the Soviets had been developing propaganda. And what seems to have happened is both the Soviets, the Russian Soviets, and the Americans had started using these rather high-powered propaganda techniques to fight the Germans. And then the Germans were suddenly out of the equation. And so then they went straight after each other, because that's what propaganda does. Propaganda always needs a them. There's an us and a them. And eventually propaganda would reach out and circle everything. And I think what you see happening is that at the end of the 1940s, for instance, you see the big media, which at that time was radio, soon to be television, as CBS went from radio to television, and NBC also did the same. You would see the big media suddenly pushing out this message. And that message, the official message, was anti-communist. But it was also, be an industrial person, or post-industrial eventually. Be this new person, always progress, 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 progress. Everything is progress. And the new is always better than the old. And all of these kinds of messages, you see the same messages today in different forms. Today, people tend to think they are evolved. That's like the most propagandistic phrase I've ever heard. I've never met an evolved person. They're still all human beings. They're still all subject to the evil that lurks inside of all of us. They are still subject to delusions. They are still subject to... They also do very good things. But, I tend to think that the framers of the U.S. Constitution were much more evolved than most people are today, even though they were obviously had their deep sins just like you all do, and I do. But that's the other thing from the 1950s. By the end of the 1950s, the propaganda arm of the large mass propaganda arm began to find its opposite in the counterculture, particularly starting with the beatniks and the folk revival movement, and eventually rock and roll would all become part of this countercultural variant. And eventually, this would lead us to where we are today. But that's a long story. And I've been droning on too long. I think I'm going to stop now. But you need to look into history. And don't trust everything I've just told you. If you think I've made a mistake, let me know. More importantly, let me know with chapter and verse. That is to say, let me know which historian or which reputable writer actually said something I said was wrong. And I'm certainly willing to admit it because, one person can't possibly understand all of this. But you need a general framework if you want to understand any of it. Well, thanks for listening. I don't know who's listening. 6 people, 600, 6,000, whatever. But do some research yourself. Get your head out of the media. Start reading. Start trying to figure out for yourself how we got to where we are. Challenge what I'm saying, but challenge what everyone says. And don't just accept the big media stories as they come down to you, especially these days. That's just diabolical to do so. You're just giving yourself into the hands of propaganda. If you want to help out, there's a PayPal link down below. And you know what? Just keep swimming against the stream. That's the Anadromous Life.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.